Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Before we get to today's episode, just a warning that this is about domestic violence, and the details of the story may be disturbing to some listeners. Today on the show, I'm talking to Molly Hayes, a national reporter for The Globe. For about 3 years now, Molly's been covering the aftermath of a tragedy that unfolded in a small town in Ontario called Burk's Falls, just outside the Muskoka region. The story starts with a discovery.
So it was around 7:30 on February 23rd, 2018, that Julia Conway arrived home at her boyfriend's house.
This is Molly Hayes.
She spent a ton of time there. They knew essentially to expect her after work unless they made other plans. But when she got to the house that night, it wasn't that late, but everything was dark, and she just sort of figured the family had called an early night. But when she got in, the family had a little chihuahua, and it was barking in the basement.
Julia followed the sound and walked down to the basement, and that's when she saw her boyfriend, Ulla Theoret, laying on the ground.
And at first she thought maybe he'd been sick. She didn't know what was going on. And then as she got closer, she realized that he'd been shot. So she ran upstairs, in shock. And that's when she made two more discoveries. First was Paul's mom, Ulla. She too had been shot and killed. And then Paul's grandmother, Raya, was also shot and killed in the house.
Julia then goes into the kitchen to call for help and finds a fourth body at the table.
And it takes her a little while to figure out who this is. But she eventually sort of realizes she knows the man, and she's seen him sitting in that same chair where he was before. It's the family's neighbor, Mark Jones.
This neighbor, Mark Jones, had been trying to court Paul's mom, Ulla, for years. Later, police would confirm what happened that night. Jones had shot and killed Ulla, her son Paul, and her mother Raya, and then shot himself. And because he was dead, there would be no trial. And Ulla Theoret's two surviving sons, Thomas and Hans, would be left wondering how this happened, and if anything could have been done to prevent it. Since then, the case has been examined by the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, notable since Ulla Theoret and Mark Jones weren't actually a couple. The review wasn't public, but it was completed in July, and last month, Ulla's family gave Molly a copy of the report. Molly's on the show today, and she's going to tell us what the report recommended, what this case tells us about the complexities of domestic violence, and the red flags that are often missed by police. You're listening to The Decibel. Hey, Molly, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Molly, what made you first want to look into this case?
The level of violence, this is just a tragedy that I think a lot of people would have a hard time wrapping their heads around. But I think it also was a case that just really highlighted the complexities of intimate partner violence. Mm-hmm. Not only our understanding of what constitutes violence, but also our understanding of what constitutes a relationship. And so it felt like a case that really just deserved a further examination.
So who was Ulla Theoret?
So Ulla was a nurse. She was a mother of three. She'd spent a lot of her adult life in Michigan, where she had raised her three sons. But after they had grown up and had moved on, she ended up moving back to rural Ontario, where her parents had retired to help take care of them.
So how did she meet Mark Jones, and what was the nature of their relationship?
So Mark and Ulla weren't a couple in any sort of official or traditional sense, but he had tried aggressively to court her. So they knew each other going back through Ulla's brother. The men had been part of a group of friends when they were younger that, would go on hunting trips on weekends together and hang out at school. In later years, they sort of reconnected when they both ended up back in this small town, Burk's Falls. Mm-hmm. And Ulla was recently single. She was divorced. Her son supported her dating. She had an active social life. She was a bubbly woman by all accounts. And Mark was interested.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like they did spend, a lot of time together at first. They both liked antiquing. But by all accounts, she wasn't interested in Mark, and she had made that clear. But in the months and even year leading up to her death, she'd become increasingly fearful of him because his attempts to court her had become increasingly aggressive and threatening.
How so?
So, in fact, 6 months before Ulla was killed, she had gone to police and she'd told them that Mark Jones had sexually assaulted her. She'd confided in several friends about this, and they'd urged her to go to police. So in September of 2017, she went and told them that this had happened about 2 years earlier, but she didn't feel safe. She told them she didn't want to press charges, though, and they didn't. But it was clear from what she told friends that this was something she took seriously. She also described threatening and stalking behavior, and this behavior was something that some of her friends and other people in the community had also witnessed firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
So some examples, she started dating someone new, and Mark Jones would drive by his house yelling at him. Mm-hmm. He would threaten both of them. He would leave notes and gifts in her mailbox. And one of the most chilling details that came out in this report is that one time Mark had been at her family's home looking at the family's guns, her dad's old hunting rifles. And he had picked one up and pointed at her, and it wasn't loaded, but he pulled the trigger. It's called a dry fire.
Wow.
Yeah. So the report doesn't say she told that detail to police, but she did report, quote, stalking and threatening behaviors.
So how was this murder, investigated initially?
So because this was a triple murder-suicide, there were no charges to be laid after the killings, So there was no sort of public police investigation after that was concluded. I don't know what happened behind the scenes. It's a question that I've asked to the OPP. Was there any sort of review done here? They wouldn't comment on that to me. And again, no trial, no commitment by the province to an inquest. One of the only avenues that Thomas and Hans had for answers was through what's called the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee.
And what is this committee?
So the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee is a panel. It's overseen by the coroner's office, and they conduct reviews of all cases of intimate partner homicide in Ontario. So the goal is very much like an inquest process. It's to come up with recommendations that could be used to prevent future deaths. And they do this, they have a list of 41 risk factors that they look for in the cases. So in hindsight, these are risk factors that they say indicate the potential for lethality. Mm-hmm. And they range from anything like if the perpetrator was abused or witnessed domestic violence as a child, an age disparity between the couple, a new partner in the victim's life, or an actual or pending separation. Unemployment can be a risk factor, depression, mm-hmm. prior threats to commit suicide, obsessive behavior, sexual jealousy, destruction of property, prior forced sexual acts, choking or strangling, violence against family pets, access or possession of guns or firearms, and if the victim has an intuitive sense of fear of the perpetrator. So in most cases they review, there's at least 7 risk factors that they say were present. In this case, there were 13.
And why did this committee decide to look into this case a year after it happened?
So when I reported on this case in 2019, the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee had been sort of non-committal about whether they would review this case because of the complexity of this relationship. It wasn't clear to them whether this fit their mandate. They weren't a couple. They hadn't really been a couple. But after the story ran, they said that, it did warrant a probe, that they would be looking at this. And in 2020, they conducted their review.
And what were the recommendations that came out of the review?
So this review led to 3 recommendations, all of them for the Ministry of the Solicitor General, which oversees police. So the first 2 recommendations were around policies and training for police, specifically in cases where victims of sex assault are reluctant to proceed with charges. They also stress the need for a broadened or more comprehensive understanding of what intimate partner violence is. So, they stress that police need to recognize that relationships don't just have to be marriages or dating. They can be brief or casual or secret, or even in this case, largely one-sided, but those same risks can still be there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last recommendation was that the Ontario Police College use this as a case study to help train investigators on these issues moving forward.
Another thing that came up in your reporting is the patchwork of data we have around domestic violence. And why is that a problem?
These are things that are pointed to by stakeholders and researchers as being really crucial in sort of painting a picture of the landscape of this violence in Canada. But the problem is that they are super inconsistent. So not every province has one at all. And even the ones that do, they have different scopes. So, some of them will do a report every few years that looks at sort of a sampling of cases, whereas Ontario, for example, is committed to looking at every case of intimate partner homicide. There's also distinctions in terms of how they define these cases. So some of them will look at cases where children have been killed, and other provinces won't include those. So we're just getting a really inconsistent picture.
Do we have a sense of how many cases there are where there's this kind of ambiguity around the relationship and whether or not it should be counted as domestic violence? What percentage of deaths may be slipping through the cracks because of this?
So experts have said that they believe as many as 20% of domestic violence deaths might be overlooked because of those issues. They might not be in clearly or traditionally defined relationships, and that relationship might be missed by investigators.
What do you think would have been different in the case of Ulla Theoret and her family had her relationship with Mark Jones been considered an intimate partner relationship?
So one of the things that the committee's report points out is that had her allegations of sex assault been considered in this domestic or intimate partner violence context, then it's possible they would have investigated further and this could have led to mandatory charges.
Mm-hmm.
In Ontario, domestic violence charges are mandatory. The idea of this is that it takes the burden off the shoulders of the victim to decide whether or not to lay charges, because these are often partners and family members. But that wasn't the case in this.
So this was a relationship where a man was pursuing this woman, so it was kind of a one-sided relationship. What other kinds of relationships may not be considered intimate partner relationships in the eyes of the police?
An obvious one that comes to mind is sex work. These may be brief, intimate encounters, but the same risks can still be present.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that experts have flagged. If somebody is having a workplace relationship or an affair, that might not be considered domestic in nature.
Okay, so based on your reporting, what do you think is the takeaway here about how we should think about domestic violence?
I think the report lays out, important recommendations for police, but I think it also highlights the need to sort of establish a better understanding for all of us across the country of what intimate partner violence looks like. The police didn't see it as that. Her friends and family didn't see it as that. And even the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee was initially sort of non-committal about whether this case met their mandate. I think this is a case where people, because they didn't consider it domestic violence, they didn't sort of recognize the level of risk that was there. We know that one of the questions that women often get asked are why don't you leave? But, this is a case where she didn't live with him. This wasn't her partner. She wasn't dating him. So I think a lot of people around them felt like, she had rebuffed his advances. She made it clear she wasn't interested. So I think that in a lot of people's minds, just generally speaking, would eliminate some of the risk. And that's not necessarily the case. So we have this list of 41 risk factors. Experts know what the warning signs are. And there's value in looking for these in hindsight to make these recommendations to prevent future deaths. But these are things we should all be looking for well before that point. Mm-hmm. But we really just don't have a great sense of what the warning signs are and what to look for before physical violence happens.
Okay, Molly, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandakar. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Molly Hayes. You can find her on Twitter at Molly Hayes. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.